February 19, 1943. The desert is still. Too still, as if the air is waiting for something to break. A faint vibration runs across the sand, almost imperceptible. Not from engines yet, but from tension. An algorithmic kind of tension. The kind that settles into human nerves when they realize they've stepped into a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. At the mouth of the Kasserine Pass, American soldiers of the two corps brace behind thin defensive lines. Many are young. Many believe they understand war. They do not. Not here. Not yet. The mountains rise like silent teeth on both sides, jagged ridges carved by wind, shadow, and time. But it is the silence that unnerves them. A desert silence that feels computed, as if every echo is being measured by something unseen. Then, a distant engine coughs. Another follows. A low, metallic growl grows in layers, like a mechanical creature assembling itself beyond the hills. Some men freeze, unsure whether the sound is real or an auditory hallucination brought on by tension. Others grip their rifles tighter, their breath turning shallow. A young radio operator adjusts his headset. He taps the receiver twice, unsure if the static is equipment malfunction or interference in the atmosphere. He whispers into the mic. "Command, this is Outpost Able. I'm hearing something. Multiple engines. Heavy ones. I can't get a stable." The transmission cuts. A sharp burst of static snaps like an electrical nerve firing. And then the horizon moves. Rommel's vanguard bursts through a cloud of sand, half-tracks, panzers, armored cars, advancing with a precision that feels almost unnatural to the Americans watching. Not supernatural. Just experienced. Engineered. Calculated. For a split second, the American line hesitates, caught between training manuals and the terrifying clarity of reality. What they see is not theory. Not diagrams. Not war games. It is a force designed to break them. The first shells fall. A thunderous impact. Another. Sand erupts in columns as the desert awakens to violence. And in that moment, that first brutal moment, something cracks. Not a fortification. Not a tank. But confidence. The Americans realize they are not facing enemy units. They are facing a doctrine sharpened by years of combat, and they are the ones who are untested. The desert has delivered its opening sentence. Kasserine will now write the rest. Before the shells began to fall at Kasserine, the United States Army carried a quiet assumption, a belief shaped more by industry and optimism than by battlefield scars. In early 1943, the two corps was still a force in transition, a mixture of fresh divisions, incomplete doctrine, and officers trying to interpret a war they had not yet faced directly. On paper, the formations looked solid. The Americans had tanks, artillery, supply lines, and an expanding air force overhead. But paper is a fragile medium in the desert. The truth, hidden between optimistic reports and uneven field experience, was that the U.S. Army was still learning how to think in terms of modern war, and learning under a clock that never stopped ticking. Consider the armored units. The M3 Lee and the early Shermans were reliable machines, but their crews were not yet fluent in combined arms movement. Their radios worked, but their communication discipline did not. Orders arrived fragmented. Timings stretched. Columns drifted out of alignment in the dust, a subtle but dangerous drift, a kind of human latency the Germans had already learned to exploit. American infantry divisions faced other issues: inconsistent training cycles, inexperienced NCOs, and commanders who still relied on linear, predictable tactics. Many believed that firepower alone could compensate for inexperience. But firepower without timing is simply noise. And timing, real battlefield timing, was something the Americans had not yet learned to compute. Even the commanders of the two corps felt the strain. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, issuing orders from bunkers far behind the front, spoke through a maze of code words and fragmented instructions that confused subordinates rather than coordinated them. Decisions arrived delayed, half-formed, or burdened by unnecessary complexity. Soldiers joked that his orders read like a puzzle. But puzzles, unlike war, can be solved without consequences. The Germans, meanwhile, read the Americans with uncomfortable clarity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent years refining mobile warfare, desert warfare, into a precise, repeatable sequence. He did not just attack positions, he attacked the spaces between them. The communications gaps, the hesitation, the imbalance between theory and instinct. In North Africa, every flaw becomes magnified. A missed reconnaissance report becomes a lost ridge. A late artillery correction becomes a breakthrough. A hesitant officer becomes a compromised flank. And by February 1943, these gaps in the American system were no longer theoretical. They were visible from the air, traceable in the sand, and measurable in the way units maneuvered with slight, but fatal, delays. The two corps had strength. But strength without coherence is only mass, and the desert is unforgiving to anything that moves without unity. As Rommel prepared his advance, the Americans believed they were facing a local counterattack. They did not understand that the opening blow would be a test not of weapons, but of the entire architecture of their young army. A test they were not yet prepared to pass. And the desert, silent, vast, indifferent, was about to record their mistakes with perfect clarity. The morning of February 19th did not begin with a dramatic charge. It began with a probe, a careful, needle-thin test of American reactions. Rommel understood the geometry of hesitation, and he used it as a weapon. Before committing his armored columns, he sent reconnaissance elements forward, motorcycles, armored cars, and half-tracks moving with a deliberate irregularity, as if mapping the American line by sound, dust pattern, and tempo. From the American perspective, these movements felt uncertain, almost random. But nothing in Rommel's method was random. He watched how U.S. units shifted positions under pressure, how long it took them to relay a warning, how quickly supporting artillery responded. Every delay, every latency spike in the American system, fed into his next decision. By midday, German artillery began to register American positions. Not with overwhelming fire, but with controlled bursts designed to stress-test the defense. A battery would fire 3 rounds, then go silent for 7 minutes. Another would fire a short pattern, deliberately incomplete. The effect was strangely psychological, an unpredictable, almost algorithmic rhythm that prevented American units from settling into a routine. Inside U.S. positions, officers attempted to interpret the pattern. Some believed the Germans were adjusting their aim. Others thought it was harassment fire. The truth was simpler. Rommel was watching them think. And the speed of their thinking was slower than the speed of his attack plan. At 1300 hours, the probing ended. The real breach began. A formation of Panzer III and IV tanks emerged from the dust cloud on the western flank, moving in a tight wedge. American observers reported the formation as compressed, but it was compression with purpose. Every turret overlapping fields of fire, every hull using the one in front as a shield. To inexperienced American gunners, the German advance looked too coordinated, almost unnatural, as if the tanks were following a single, precise instruction set. American anti-tank crews opened fire. The first rounds struck, but often at poor angles. Some ricocheted. Others hit frontal armor that could absorb the impact. The gunners adjusted, but every adjustment took seconds. And in mechanized warfare, seconds are a currency the inexperienced cannot afford. The German response was immediate. Not loud, not chaotic, just precise. Their return fire eliminated exposed gun crews with chilling efficiency. The Americans fired back again and again, but their fields of fire overlapped poorly. Units that were supposed to support each other were separated by terrain, misunderstanding, or both. It wasn't collapse. Not yet. It was something quieter, desynchronization. Infantry pulling back too fast. Armor advancing too slowly. Artillery firing off the mark because coordinates arrived incomplete or late. A system designed for order was drifting into disorder, one small discrepancy at a time. Rommel, watching the battlefield from a forward observation post, recognized the moment he'd been waiting for. the moment when the American line no longer moved as a line, but as disconnected fragments. He ordered the armored spearhead to accelerate. The breach widened, and the desert absorbed everything without comment, as if recording the event for some future, impartial machine to analyze. The Kasserine Pass is narrow, too narrow for comfort, and far too narrow for error. Once German armor pushed into the corridor, the Americans were forced into a defensive pattern they had never rehearsed. The terrain dictated movement, not command. The walls of the pass bent everything inward, compressing units, compressing decisions, compressing fear. As the German spearhead entered the pass, dust transformed the battlefield into a layered fog, tan, metallic, vibrating with static. Soldiers later described the dust not as dust, but as something thicker, almost particulate, as if the desert itself had turned into a low-resolution atmosphere. Shapes blurred. Sound refracted. Orders dissolved halfway through the air. A U.S. artillery observer tried to correct fire on the advancing panzers. He saw movement, raised his field glasses, and froze for a second. The heat distortions made every tank appear doubled, one real, one shimmering like a ghost version half a meter to the left. His report hesitated by a fraction of a second. That fraction mattered. American artillery fired late. German tanks fired first. The initial shells slammed into the forward positions of the 19th Combat Engineers. Their line bent, not from cowardice, but from a simple, brutal mismatch in readiness. These troops had never fought tanks in confined terrain. They had practiced charges, barricades, demolitions, but not this. Not armored columns threading through a corridor like metal serpents executing a memorized pattern. In the pass, the psychological pressure grew exponential. Sound behaved strangely, echoing in short loops, recycling itself in the stone walls. A machine gun burst repeated more times than it should have. A tank track rattled with an almost rhythmic, mechanical stutter, like a pattern glitching but refusing to break. Some soldiers instinctively looked behind them, sensing movement that wasn't there. The desert creates illusions. The mind completes them. American units attempted to reposition, but the narrow terrain turned every retreat into a traffic problem. Jeeps, half-tracks, supply trucks, all trapped in a converging bottleneck. One stalled engine became a node of paralysis. One overturned vehicle created a full stop. Logistics, which should have been flexible, became painfully brittle. This was the moment Rommel understood he had achieved what he wanted: momentum inside a confined system. Once momentum exists inside such a space, it grows like pressure in a sealed chamber, compressing everything ahead of it. German infantry pushed behind their armor with uncanny confidence. Their formations were not perfect. Nothing in war is perfect, but they were practiced enough that they looked almost synchronized to the Americans watching them advance. The enemy seemed to move with a shared intention, as if wired to the same tactical instinct. U.S. resistance faltered, then fractured, then fragmented into pockets of isolated fire. And yet, even in collapse, there were flashes of stubborn defense. A machine gun team held its position longer than any logical model predicted. A lone Sherman, turret traversing slowly through dust haze, fired until its barrel glowed faintly red. A medic sprinted through open ground with a decisiveness that defied the chaos around him. Human resilience appearing at statistically improbable moments, like anomalous spikes in an otherwise predictable curve. But resilience alone cannot change geometry. The pass constricted. The Germans advanced. The Americans retreated, sometimes by order, sometimes by instinct. And above all of it, the desert remained silent, a neutral witness, storing everything with perfect fidelity. By late afternoon, the American defense no longer resembled a coherent front. It resembled something else, a scattering of nodes, each fighting its own private battle, each unaware that the larger structure had begun to fail. Once cohesion dissolves, retreat is not merely movement backward, it is a kind of unspooling. A slow, unraveling of intention. At the mouth of the pass, German tanks broke through the final engineering barricades with brutal efficiency. The sound was heavy and percussive, like steel chewing through steel. The shockwaves rolled across the narrow valley, bouncing off rock walls with a strange, clipped resonance, as if the audio of battle had been slightly compressed. A group of American infantry tried to form a new defensive line near a shallow rise. They fired steadily, but their fields of fire overlapped poorly, creating pockets where German infantry slipped through like water finding cracks in a dam. Command tried to reassign units, but radio networks flickered. Messages arrived late, partially clipped, or repeated the wrong call sign. One transmission, recorded in a field log, came through as, "All units, pull, pull, pull back to, wait, no, forward, negative, disregard, hold." Static swallowed the rest. That single moment captured the state of the two corps, overloaded, misaligned, and forced to compute decisions faster than its doctrine allowed. Further inside the pass, chaos multiplied. Retreating vehicles choked the single-lane tracks. A supply truck stalled. A half-track swerved to avoid it and slid into a shallow ditch. Another vehicle tried to maneuver around both and got wedged between a rock and a fuel trailer, a geometry problem with lethal implications. The Germans exploited this instantly. Their armored cars moved forward in sharp bursts, firing precisely, as if following a targeting grid. Every American vehicle trapped in the choke point became either an obstacle or a target. A U.S. lieutenant attempted to reorganize his men, shouting orders over the clatter of machine guns. His voice cracked, not from fear, but from the impossible bandwidth of trying to control too many variables at once. The desert does not give leaders time to think, it gives them time to react, and sometimes that is not enough. The psychological effect of envelopment began to take hold. Soldiers felt the enemy on their left, then on their right, then, impossibly, in front again. Not because the Germans moved supernaturally fast, but because the terrain forced circular confusion. The pass bent vision, compressed movement, and made direction feel like a malfunctioning compass. A medic later described it as fighting inside a throat that was swallowing us. At 1700 hours, the collapse reached its tipping point. American forces began withdrawing in waves, some orderly, some frantic. Officers tried to establish checkpoints and rally points, but the Germans moved too quickly. The fallback routes were clogged. The desert daylight dimmed into a dust-hazed twilight, where silhouettes looked distorted, as if someone had stretched them vertically. The two corps was not just retreating. It was being pushed into a shape it had never rehearsed. A shape defined by the enemy. A shape defined by the terrain. A shape defined by failure in real time. And yet, within this collapse, fragments of resistance still glowed, like isolated pixels refusing to fade. A single artillery battery held its position far longer than expected. A group of riflemen covered a retreat with astonishing discipline. A tank destroyer crew refused to abandon its vehicle even as it burned from the rear. Human determination, flickering inside a system breaking apart. But determination could not halt the momentum that now belonged entirely to Rommel. The breach was complete. And the desert, ever indifferent, absorbed the defeat with silent precision. The retreat from Kasserine did not unfold in a straight line. It folded back on itself, like fabric pulled too tightly, wrinkling in unpredictable directions. American units attempted to withdraw along roads never designed for simultaneous movement of tanks, trucks, ambulances, and men on foot. The result was not a column. It was congestion disguised as motion. As German pressure increased, the roads became a paradox. The more the Americans tried to move, the less they moved. Engines idled in frustration, then overheated. Dust rose in thick curtains that turned headlights into glowing orbs, suspended in particle-heavy air. Drivers leaned out of windows, trying to see more than 2 or 3 meters ahead, and seeing instead, nothing. Nothing but a low-frequency blur. Fuel trucks attempted to push through the mass, but every maneuver created a ripple of braking, shouting, and frantic hand signals. A jeep clipped a trailer. A half-track reversed slightly too far and struck a motorcycle messenger. Not fatal, but enough to halt the entire segment of the convoy for 10 minutes. 10 minutes that the Germans used with machine-like efficiency. Artillery units attempted to reposition. But artillery, unlike infantry, does not shift easily. One misplaced gun carriage blocks the next. A jammed limber freezes the battery. A single wheel stuck in a pothole becomes a tactical vulnerability. And vulnerabilities multiply quickly when the enemy is advancing with synchronized intent. In the confusion, supply officers fought a losing battle against numbers. Ammunition crates were opened at random. Rations spilled into the sand. Fuel cans were stacked and res-tacked, then forgotten as units moved without warning. The desert seemed to absorb these losses with quiet hunger, swallowing resources, swallowing time. Meanwhile, the German advance pressed forward with unnerving clarity. Their armored cars moved along the high ridges, flanking the slow-moving U.S. columns. Their optics scanned the valley floor like sensors mapping a three-dimensional problem. When they identified a concentration of vehicles, they did not rush. They waited for the perfect angle. Then a short sequence of shells descended, precise, narrow, almost surgical. American vehicles burst into flame with a hollow thump. Not an explosion. A collapse. Metal giving way under thermal stress. The fire spread through spilled fuel. Soldiers scrambled to pull drivers from burning cabs. Others simply ran, unable to tell where safety might exist in a landscape collapsing into chaos. Orders tried to travel through this environment. But orders are fragile in motion. A battalion received instructions to hold a ridge, only to discover the ridge already abandoned. Another unit was told to counterattack. The designated attack route was now blocked by wrecked trucks. One colonel, attempting to establish a defensive line, realized his units had scattered to 3 different grid coordinates. Rommel did not need to annihilate the 2 corps. He only needed to pressure it until its internal architecture failed under load. And that architecture, communications, logistics, cohesion, was bending toward failure with every passing minute. By nightfall, the retreat had lost even the pretense of coordination. Soldiers moved not by order, but by instinct, toward distant lights, toward the sound of friendly engines, toward any space that felt marginally less dangerous. Some platoons marched through darkness guided only by the glow of burning vehicles behind them, a haunting, flickering backdrop that made the landscape look artificial, as if rendered moment by an imperfect machine. And still, the German advance did not stop. It pressed deeper. It pressed faster. It pressed with the confidence of an army that understood both its own strengths and its enemy's vulnerabilities. The 2 corps would survive. But the idea of the 2 corps, the confident, modern force imagined in American war plans, was burning out behind them. And the desert, again, held the memory of this failure with flawless neutrality. By the second night of the German advance, the 2 corps had reached a critical threshold, a point where command no longer commanded, and control existed only in theory. This was not collapse in the cinematic sense. It was collapse in the logistical sense, slower, quieter, more corrosive. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, operating from a bunker miles behind the front, continued issuing detailed, over-engineered orders. But detail is not utility. His instructions arrived in coded fragments that required interpretation at a time when interpretation had become a luxury. He would send messages like, "Move elements of X force to position R1 via route Orange, unless situation Y becomes critical." But situation Y had already become critical hours earlier. And route Orange no longer existed in any meaningful sense. It was blocked by abandoned vehicles, burning wreckage, and the slow churn of retreating units. Fredendall's orders moved more slowly than the battlefield. And any order that moves slower than reality becomes obsolete on arrival. Subordinate commanders tried to compensate, but each one possessed only a partial view of the front, a mosaic composed of incomplete radio traffic, panicked messengers, and contradictory field reports. This created a strange effect, multiple officers giving reasonable orders based on incomplete data, resulting in unreasonable movement overall. For example, a battalion was told to reinforce the left flank. Another battalion was told to withdraw from that flank. A third, believing both orders applied, split the difference, and went nowhere. At one point, a regimental HQ received 3 different grid coordinates for its fallback line. All 3 were wrong. One didn't exist on their maps. Another was held by Germans. The third was a dry creek now filled with wrecked vehicles. This was not incompetence, it was system overload. The Germans, meanwhile, behaved like a well-trained algorithm. Not perfect, but optimized. Their reconnaissance units fed information into their advance with minimal distortion. Their lines of communication stayed flexible, almost elastic. They made mistakes. Of course they did. But their errors were buffered by experience and decentralized initiative. American errors, by contrast, echoed through the ranks with multiplying effect. A single misinterpreted radio call could redirect an entire company. A misheard map grid could send armored units down the wrong valley. A pause in communication could freeze thousands of men in place, waiting for guidance that would not arrive. As night deepened, the atmosphere itself began to distort perception. Darkness in the desert is not uniform, it comes in gradients. Some areas appear almost velvet black. Others shimmer with residual heat, creating the illusion of movement. Soldiers reported seeing silhouettes that turned out to be rocks. Others saw rocks that moved like silhouettes. Command posts struggled to track units that were no longer where they were supposed to be. One intelligence officer described the map as a static picture of a dynamic disaster. Some units held firm despite the chaos. A battalion of the 1st Infantry Division dug in with stubborn discipline and slowed a German advance by sheer force of will. A group of tank destroyers took up positions without orders and fired until their ammunition ran dry. These acts of resistance were impressive, but isolated. And isolation, in warfare, is just another form of vulnerability. By the late hours, the two corps had reached the moment historians later called its command fracture. The point where intention no longer matched action, where information no longer matched reality, where leadership no longer matched necessity. And in that gap, the space where action and intention drift apart, defeat grows. Across the pass, German units kept pushing, not recklessly, but with a cold precision. Every kilometer gained felt like a calculation completed. Every stalled American unit felt like a solved problem. The two corps was still fighting. But it was no longer fighting as a single entity. It had become a collection of isolated efforts, brave, determined, but fundamentally disjointed. The desert, as always, stored each discrepancy with silent accuracy. As dawn approached on February 20th, the American command attempted something that felt both necessary and improbable, reorganizing a battered, partially dislocated force under active pursuit. Stabilization in such conditions is not a straightforward process, it is closer to triage, improvisation performed at scale. General Eisenhower's staff, receiving fragmented reports of the disaster, pushed for immediate restructuring. Reinforcements were redirected. Air support was recalibrated. But recalibration only matters if the front line can survive long enough to receive it. The two corps began forming what officers later called stop lines, though in practice they were more like friction points, temporary resistance zones meant to slow the German advance rather than halt it entirely. The first attempt formed near Jebel el Hamra, a cluster of ridges that offered better defensive ground than the pass itself. Units that reached the area did so with wildly different levels of cohesion. Some arrived intact. Others appeared in disordered streams, vehicles missing turrets, soldiers covered in dust thick enough to blur their features, officers carrying maps that no longer matched the battlefield. Yet, despite the chaos, something resembling structure began to reappear. Artillery batteries rolled into position and unpacked their guns with mechanical determination. Engineers laid mines along approach routes, marking them with improvised symbols, stacked rocks, bits of cloth tied to shrubs, whatever the retreat had not already devoured. Infantry companies dug shallow foxholes, their movements automatic, almost muscle-coated. There was no dramatic pep talk. No declaration of renewed strength. Just a quiet, almost exhausted acceptance. We hold here, or we run again. But even as the Americans tried to rebuild their line, the desert carried the faint hum of German engines, steady, directional, mathematically consistent. Rommel's vanguard approached with a measured tempo, as if verifying the Americans' attempt to regain coherence before deciding how best to take it apart. When the first German reconnaissance units crested the distant ridge, American spotters described the silhouette as too clean, a perfect geometric outline against the rising light. Moments later, artillery fire from the U.S. side erupted, not in panic, but in a synchronized barrage. Shells landed near the advancing vehicles, kicking up columns of dust that rose like vertical static on a broken screen. This time, the American timing was better. This time, the retreat had burned away hesitation. This time, every second was used with intention. The Germans slowed, probing the new line carefully. Their units maneuvered across the flank, searching for gaps. For the first time since entering the pass, they encountered resistance that did not instantly deform under pressure. And in that brief interval, measured in minutes, maybe less, an unexpected shift occurred. The battlefield rhythm, which had been entirely German-controlled, began to wobble. Not reverse. Not turn. Just wobble. Introduce noise into a signal, and even a powerful advance must adjust its tempo. American commanders seized on that wobble. Units that had been retreating stopped. Units that had been scattered coalesced. A peculiar steadiness took hold, fragile, patchwork, but real. One captain described the moment as, "Everything was still broken, but it was broken in the same direction." German forces increased pressure. Their artillery began bracketing the ridges. Their tanks probed the flanks like metal sensors sweeping for vulnerabilities. The Americans absorbed the blows, firing back with an almost stubborn consistency. For the first time in 2 days, the two corps did not yield ground. It did not win. It did not counterattack. But it held. And holding, in that moment, was a victory measured not in territory, but in time. Time the Americans desperately needed. Time that would be used to bring in reinforcements, reorganize command, and rebuild a doctrine still learning how to survive contact with reality. The desert watched silently as both armies recalculated their next moves. By mid-morning on February 20th, the Germans began testing the newly formed American line with the same disciplined aggression they had used in the pass. The difference now was the environment: open ridges, wider fields of fire, and a U.S. force that, despite exhaustion and disarray, had found a temporary rhythm. Rommel understood that rhythm immediately. He also understood how to break it. His forward elements advanced in staggered groups, never giving the Americans a single, clean firing solution. Panzers moved in short, deliberate bursts: stop, observe, fire, advance, like pieces in a mechanical sequence. Their supporting infantry dismounted and spread across the rocky terrain with practiced spacing, minimizing the effect of American artillery. The first German shells landed in a controlled arc along the American front. Not a barrage. A sampling. A methodical measurement of responses: how quickly U.S. batteries countered, how accurately they returned fire, how their timing had evolved after the retreat. The Germans were not guessing, they were collecting data. American artillery, for its part, fired with unexpected discipline. Crews worked with the urgency of men who understood that precision meant survival. Their corrections were faster now, their bracketing tighter. The retreat had burned away hesitation. What remained was focus, raw, tense, algorithmic focus. Some shells struck dangerously close to advancing panzers, forcing them to angle away and reposition. A few hit directly, sending plumes of debris into the air. These impacts disrupted the German tempo, creating momentary gaps, micro-intervals in an otherwise continuous machine. Rommel's officers adjusted. They brought up anti-tank guns and began trading fire with American positions. Their rounds struck with violent clarity, sharp, clean impacts that threw earth into geometric cones. As both sides engaged, the battlefield took on a strange dual texture, part human, part mechanical. Soldiers shouted orders that were nearly lost in the roar of engines. Radios crackled with clipped phrases, as if bandwidth had been reduced by stress itself. Each explosion echoed with a slight delay, bouncing across the ridges like audio frames misaligned by a fraction of a second. On the American right flank, a platoon held a shallow ridge against repeated probing attacks. The ground shook with the thump of German mortars, sending tremors that felt almost rhythmic, waves of force spaced with uncanny regularity. Some soldiers later described the experience as feeling the ground think. The left flank was more fragile. A gap began to form between two U.S. companies, just a few dozen meters at first, then more as units shifted under pressure. The Germans sensed it, not by luck, but by pattern recognition. Their infantry advanced into the seam with unsettling speed. American machine gun teams responded, laying down suppressive fire that carved lines of dust along the ridge. Some bursts were perfectly timed. Others drifted off target, their aim disrupted by smoke and adrenaline. In such conditions, even a 1-second delay becomes meaningful. The German pressure increased. For a moment, the American left looked as though it might fold, the start of another unraveling. Officers shouted to close the gap. Runners sprinted across open ground with messages that might not survive the trip. Artillery tried to compensate but risked hitting friendly lines. The entire left segment oscillated between coherence and collapse. Then, unexpectedly, a small American counteraction stabilized the breach. A tank destroyer platoon, late, lost, running low on fuel, arrived at the exact right moment. They turned their guns on the advancing German infantry, firing with abrupt, decisive violence. The effect was immediate. The German momentum faltered. Rommel's forces pulled back a few hundred meters, reassessing. The Americans held. Barely. Precariously. But they held. For the first time since the battle began, both armies paused at the same moment. Two organisms recalculating each other, matching tempo for tempo. The desert felt strangely still. Not peaceful. Not calm. Just still, like a system reaching temporary equilibrium before the next surge. This moment of balance would not last. But it marked a turning point. The two corps had stopped collapsing. Now, it was learning how to resist. By the afternoon of February 20th, Rommel had completed his assessment. The Americans had stabilized, clumsily, unevenly, but with surprising resilience. A lesser commander might have shifted to containment. Rommel chose rupture. His goal was simple: break the two corps before it could finish rebuilding its internal structure. If the Americans solidified their line any further, their numerical and logistical advantages would eventually overwhelm the Afrika Korps. But at this moment, this narrow window, they were still vulnerable. Still reorganizing. Still learning. Rommel timed his strike with mechanical precision. He ordered a concentrated assault on the American left flank, the same sector that had nearly collapsed earlier. Not because it was the weakest, but because it was the most recently repaired. And repaired systems often fail under renewed stress. At 1600 hours, German artillery opened fire with alarming accuracy. The rounds landed not on the main American positions but on their connecting corridors, paths for runners, radio teams, and supply carriers. In other words, the arteries of cohesion. It was a deliberate strategy. Don't kill the body. Kill its circulation. American positions quickly felt the effect. Communications became patchy. Platoons became unsure whether they were meant to hold or fall back. Some officers received no orders at all, forcing them to improvise under fire. Then the panzers moved. Not in a massed wave, but in a staggered pattern that confused observers. 3 tanks advancing, 2 halting, 1 drifting to the right, then realigning. The movement looked random. It wasn't. It was a pressure weave, a tactic designed to create multiple threats at different depths simultaneously. A test of American ability to prioritize targets under stress. American anti-tank crews responded, but their fields of fire were cluttered with smoke, dust, and the broken geometry of the terrain. Some gunners saw only partial silhouettes. Others misjudged distance due to heat distortion. A few fired too early, revealing their positions. German infantry exploited each opening. A squad captured a low ridge. Another slipped through a shallow defile. A machine gun team took position behind a boulder that had been overlooked in earlier reconnaissance. The American left flank began to deform again, not collapse, but stretch, like material under too much load. Officers shouted contradictory instructions. Soldiers fired at shapes they could not fully confirm. A tank destroyer fired a round that echoed strangely, bouncing off the ridge walls with a metallic warble, the sound stretched as if by faulty audio compression. At 16:22, the line nearly broke. German tanks approached within 300 meters of a vulnerable American position. Infantry followed close behind, shields of dust around them. If the Germans breached this point, the two corps would face the exact same unraveling that had consumed it at Kasserine Pass. For a few critical minutes, the American left existed in a state of mathematical fragility. Any additional pressure might have transformed strain into failure. Then, an unexpected variable entered the equation. American air support arrived. 3 P-40 Warhawks, scrambled earlier from Thalept airfield, roared over the battlefield with engines that sounded strangely distorted by the shifting desert air, high, wavering, almost synthetic. But distortion aside, they delivered exactly what was needed: disruption. Their strafing runs forced the German armor to disperse. Machine gun bursts stitched patterns through the dust. The panzers halted, turned, repositioned. The precise momentum of Rommel's strike wavered. Not stopped, just wavered. And that was enough. American artillery seized the moment, pounding the stalled German spearhead with renewed intensity. One shell struck the lead panzer, blowing its treads apart and creating a choke point that blocked the narrow approach. The German surge faltered. The American line, bent, strained, trembling, held again. Not through elegance, not through doctrine, but through survival instincts and a handful of perfectly timed variables. The two corps was learning, painfully, what it meant to fight an experienced enemy. And Rommel, watching from his forward observation point, realized that the Americans were no longer the same adversary he had crushed in the pass. They were adapting. Slowly, roughly, but undeniably. In the aftermath of the German strike, something rare happened on the American side of the battlefield. Something that felt quiet, subtle, but unmistakably significant. The two corps began to reassemble itself. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but effectively. It started at the small unit level. A platoon sergeant reorganized his scattered men with calm authority. A company commander redrew his defensive line on the back of a ration box. A communications team repaired a damaged radio using spare parts that didn't quite match, creating a connection that worked anyway, humming with an off-frequency tone. These were small actions, but they created a pattern. A pattern that looked suspiciously like control. American artillery, now fully awake to the tempo of the German attack, shifted fire with deliberate precision. Their barrages no longer felt reactive, they felt predictive. Forward observers relayed coordinates quickly, their voices sounding strangely monotone over the radio, compressed by exhaustion and the mechanical click of background static. One observer noted, the battlefield felt aligned again. Not clean, not safe, but aligned. On the ridges, infantry dug deeper positions, carving trenches into the rocky soil. The ground resisted at first, hard, unyielding, but once broken, it split in jagged chunks that made serviceable cover. Soldiers worked with a rhythm that bordered on mechanical, their shovels striking the earth in steady intervals. Behind the lines, medical teams set up aid stations under the muted glow of tarped lamps. The light created halos of pale yellow that gave the scene an oddly sterile atmosphere, like a field hospital rendered with low dynamic range. Wounded soldiers were carried in, their faces coated in dust so thick it blurred their features into single-tone silhouettes. American armor, though battered, repositioned with new discipline. Sherman tanks formed a defensive arc, their engines idling at uneven frequencies, creating a layered resonance that blended with the hum of the desert. One tank crew adjusted their turret manually when the rotation motor failed, swinging the heavy gun as a synchronized team, each motion precise, almost analog in its simplicity. Above them, the P-40s returned to refuel and rearm. The sky, once shimmering with heat distortions, now carried a cooler tone, its fading light scattering across thin clouds like lines of code written in soft orange. As the battlefield settled into this new order, American officers held improvised briefings. Maps were spread across hoods of vehicles still warm from combat. Fingers traced defensive perimeters. Voices spoke in clipped, low volumes, as if aware that the desert might echo their uncertainty. But for the first time, the conversations had coherence. For the first time, the two corps was not merely reacting. It was planning. German forces, sensing the shift, pulled back just enough to reassess the perimeter. Their reconnaissance units advanced cautiously, no longer encountering the same disarray they'd used as leverage earlier. The Americans were presenting a shape, a real, defendable shape, that could not be easily pierced. Rommel noticed this immediately. He understood that a force that adapts is a force that becomes dangerous. And the Americans, in these hours after holding the line, were beginning to show signs of adaptation at scale. Orders now traveled without distortion. Units moved without hesitation. The line, once fractured, scattered, almost absent, was becoming something solid again. Not perfect, not flawless, but functional. And functionality, in war, is sometimes the difference between defeat and survival. As daylight faded into a cold desert twilight, the two corps settled into positions that felt real. Not improvised, not temporary, but anchored. The sound of battle receded into a low hum, a steady, almost computational hum. And the desert, neutral, unblinking, observed the Americans learning to fight inside its geometry. The night after the American line held was not calm, but it carried a different texture, less chaotic, more structured. Reinforcements arrived in staggered waves, each movement adding weight to the battlefield architecture that the two corps had begun to rebuild. The first units to reach the front were elements of the 1st Infantry Division. They emerged from the darkness in disciplined columns, boots striking the ground with a steady cadence that felt strangely synchronized with the desert's nocturnal hum. Their silhouettes appeared and disappeared in the dim light, shifting outlines that looked almost like frames in a low-color animation. They brought with them something the two corps had lacked since the first collapse: coherent experience. These soldiers had fought earlier engagements in North Africa. They understood desert fighting, German tactics, and the psychological weight of open terrain. Their arrival didn't just add manpower, it added memory, the kind that stabilizes an army under stress. Behind them, supply trucks rumbled forward, headlights cutting through dust that hung in the air like suspended particulate data, thin, floating, granular. They carried ammunition, medical supplies, gasoline, and perhaps most importantly, predictability. Logistics is a form of reassurance in war, a signal to soldiers that the system supporting them is functional again. Shortly after midnight, senior commanders arrived to assess the situation. General Omar Bradley surveyed the lines with a calm, analytical posture. His voice was notably different from those earlier in the battle. Measured, unhurried, carrying a cadence that felt stabilizing. Eisenhower's directives flowed through him with clarity instead of distortion. Command tents took shape quickly, their canvas walls flapping with the cold desert wind. Inside, maps were pinned and repinned as intelligence officers updated dispositions. Colored markers created a pattern on the map that resembled a grid correcting itself, aligning, tightening, rebalancing. Radio networks, once filled with static and fragmented calls, began transmitting more consistently. Operators adjusted frequency dials with careful precision, sometimes tapping the casing of equipment as if coaxing a machine into cooperation. The background hiss faded into a smoother tone, still imperfect, but functional. This newfound stability changed the tempo of American action. Artillery units coordinated with air support. Infantry dug in deeper, establishing layered defenses instead of improvised clusters. Engineers extended minefields and repaired cratered roads, using lanterns that cast elongated shadows across the sand, shadows that drifted with slight jitter, as though the light flickered at irregular intervals. German reconnaissance had not stopped, however. Their patrols moved along the ridges, observing the American reorganization. They reported increased traffic, stronger perimeter defenses, and the unmistakable presence of fresh troops. They also noted something more subtle: the Americans no longer behaved like a routed force. Their movements were structured. Their firing patterns were consistent. Their posture had shifted from survival to consolidation. Rommel understood the implications. Time was no longer his ally. He needed a decisive blow before the Americans completed their reconstruction. But the moment for effortless exploitation had passed. The battlefield had changed shape, and the two corps had acquired something intangible yet critical: operational coherence. As dawn approached, the desert light returned in muted gradients, cool blues blending into pale sand tones. The new day revealed an American force transformed by necessity, wounded, exhausted, still carrying the trauma of retreat, but reorganized, reinforced, and aligned under a leadership that had finally arrived at the front. The two corps had survived its worst moment. Now it was preparing to fight on its own terms. And the desert, silent, indifferent, recorded the shift with perfect clarity. By the morning of February 21st, a subtle but decisive inversion had begun to ripple across the battlefield. What had started as a desperate American attempt to slow a relentless enemy was now transforming into something more structured, something that resembled the early architecture of a counteroffensive. The first visible sign of this shift came from the artillery. American batteries, now reinforced and fully supplied, began firing in synchronized sequences. Their barrages unfolded like programmed pulses, timed, layered, mathematically spaced. Forward observers relayed corrections with voices that sounded steadier than the day before, still rough from exhaustion, but now carrying the quiet confidence of regained control. Each explosion sent tremors through the ridges, accompanied by a dust cloud that rose in oddly geometric shapes: squares, wedges, elongated plumes that drifted as if following invisible vectors. It wasn't perfection, it was consistency. And consistency is the beginning of momentum. On the ground, infantry units adjusted their tactics. Where they had once fired from isolated foxholes, they now coordinated fire across multiple positions. Where they had once waited for orders, they now acted on initiative. Where they had once experienced the battlefield as noise, they now recognized its patterns. German patrols advancing toward the American perimeter encountered something unfamiliar: resistance that reacted instantly, not in delayed bursts. The Americans were learning to read the terrain with a sharper eye, avoiding kill zones and countering German movements before they fully formed. A German lieutenant wrote in his field notes, "Their behavior is different. They no longer hesitate." American armor contributed to this shift as well. Shermans took up hull-down positions on ridges, their silhouettes blending with the desert's irregular contours. Their engines idled with a low, syncopated hum, creating a background vibration that felt strangely deliberate, like static filling the gaps between actions. When German vehicles probed forward, the Shermans responded with disciplined volleys. Not frantic, not panicked, just controlled streams of fire, each one calculated to slow, redirect, or halt the German advance. German officers noticed the change immediately. Rommel, studying the shifting dynamics, recognized that the Americans were no longer reacting to his movements, they were anticipating them. His forces had operated under the assumption of American disarray. That assumption was now invalid. And invalid assumptions introduce friction into even the most refined war machine. Meanwhile, American engineers worked with growing efficiency. Roadblocks were rebuilt. Defensive trenches expanded. Minefields extended in carefully shaped patterns, arcs, lines, and clusters that turned the terrain into a navigational problem for German armor. In the air, P-40s and A-20s executed attack runs with renewed tempo. Their engines cut through the morning air like distorted audio, high-pitched, wavering, but sharp enough to force German units into defensive formations. Even when their attacks weren't lethal, they disrupted the German rhythm. And rhythm, once disrupted, is difficult to restore. By midday, the Afrika Korps found itself slowed, just slightly, but measurably. Every kilometer required more caution. Every adjustment took more time. Every maneuver encountered new layers of American interference. It wasn't a reversal. Not yet. But it was the beginning of one. The Germans had lost the effortless initiative they wielded at Kasserine Pass. What had been a smooth advance was becoming a contested one. Their timeline narrowed. Their decisions compressed. Their confidence tested. The two corps, though still battered, now possessed something fundamentally different from 2 days earlier. Agency. It was no longer simply reacting to events. It was influencing them. And the desert, ever neutral, observed the battlefield's shifting momentum with silent, perfect impartiality. By February 22, the battlefield had transformed. What only days earlier resembled a collapsing structure of fragmented American units now resembled something entirely different, a defensive grid tightening with purpose and internal logic. And as American strength reassembled, German momentum began to thin, stretch, and finally, slow. The first sign was logistical. Rommel's forces, extended deep from their supply bases, began experiencing shortages that had nothing to do with enemy action and everything to do with distance, fuel consumption, and the desert's slow, grinding attrition. Fuel trucks struggled over rough terrain. Ammunition shipments lagged. Even water, always the quiet dictator of desert warfare, had to be rationed with uncomfortable precision. German tank crews reported engines running warmer than usual. Artillery units calculated they had fewer shells than required for a sustained assault. Infantry squads felt their rations shrinking into too small increments. Rommel recognized the pattern instantly. The battlefield, its terrain, distance, and geometry, was beginning to claim operational priority over his decisions. Meanwhile, the Americans were tightening their defensive perimeter with disciplined efficiency. Infantry companies extended their trenches into interlocking arcs. Their fields of fire overlapped in a way that felt almost algorithmic, as if the units were becoming nodes in a larger, coordinated system. Communications lines, once chaotic, operated with rhythmic consistency. Radios transmitted with a tone slightly distorted by dust, producing a faint granular hiss, an artifact of the environment, or perhaps just fatigue embedded in the frequency. American artillery, now fully stocked and freshly calibrated, shifted into fire patterns that resembled a grid tightening around anticipated German movement. Shells landed in sequences that carved shapes into the desert, concentric ovals, diagonal sweeps, linear detonations that marked the battlefield as clearly as pencil lines drawn across a map. Engineers constructed fortified positions using sandbags, scrap metal, and even the twisted remains of destroyed vehicles. These improvised structures created jagged silhouettes, sharp, uneven, strangely geometric against the ridgeline. Under lantern light, the shapes looked almost mechanical, as if the battlefield itself were constructing new forms from the wreckage. German reconnaissance units probing the American line encountered resistance that felt different from previous days. Instead of scattered fire, they met coordinated volleys. Instead of panicked movements, they saw methodical adjustments. Instead of gaps, they found layered defenses that absorbed pressure without deforming. A German corporal described the change simply. They've become organized. Too organized. American air support intensified the effect. P-40s and A-20s attacked German convoys with increasing frequency. Their engines sliced through the air in sharp, wavering tones, metal, dust, and heat mixing into an acoustic signature that sounded almost synthetic. Their bombs fell in timed intervals, shaking the ground with pulses that reverberated through boots and equipment. Each strike forced Rommel to reconsider his calculations. His advance, once fluid and confident, started to sputter. His units required more fuel, more ammunition, more time. And time was something the Americans, with each passing hour, were taking away from him. By late afternoon, the battlefield reached a moment of equilibrium, one that looked nothing like the chaos of Kasserine Pass. The Americans were no longer the destabilized force fighting for survival. They were a structured defense capable of absorbing German pressure and returning it with increasing strength. Rommel felt the shift. His officers felt it. And American commanders, walking the reorganized lines, saw something in their soldiers' posture. A calm, disciplined readiness that simply had not existed 3 days earlier. The two corps was no longer breaking. It was solidifying, stabilizing, waiting for the moment when defense would finally become offense. And as the sun dipped behind the jagged ridges, The desert held this moment with precise neutrality, its silence neither comforting nor threatening, simply observing the approaching turn. The morning of February 23rd arrived with a sense of tension that felt different from all the days before. It was not dread. It was not confusion. It was compression. A kind of stillness that precedes movement, like the desert itself was holding its breath in anticipation. For the first time since the battle began, the Americans were not waiting. They were preparing. Major General Orlando Ward coordinated the armored response. Reinforced by fresh units and stabilized by stronger command structures, American tanks assembled across the ridges in formations that felt almost geometric: lines, arcs, clusters with deliberate spacing between them. The ridgeline cast long shadows that distorted their shapes, giving the impression of a larger force than actually existed. Infantry units moved into assault positions with a quiet, low-frequency hum of activity. The clinking of gear, the muffled scrape of boots against rock, the subtle shifting of equipment. These sounds merged into a texture that felt oddly patterned, like ambient noise rendered through a slightly corrupted filter. At 9 o'clock, American artillery opened fire. But this barrage was different. It came not as a sudden roar, but as a measured sequence of detonations. First close, then spreading outward, then converging. The pattern resembled a tightening spiral, drawing German units into predictable reactions. Dust rose in layered columns, creating a pale lattice against the ridge line. Rommel's forward units immediately recognized the danger. They had spent days exploiting American disorder. Now they faced a force that had repaired itself into something dangerously coherent. German tanks attempted to reposition, but their fuel levels were low, and the uneven terrain magnified every mechanical strain. Then came the armor. Shermans advanced not as a scattered response but as a synchronized push. Their engines growled with uneven harmonics, producing a mechanical vibration that carried across the desert floor. They moved with intent, slow at first, then accelerating, their tracks kicking up twin trails of dust that twisted in the wind like coded signatures. The American infantry followed, steady and deliberate. Fire teams leapfrogged forward. Machine gun crews laid down suppressive fire that stitched faint, rhythmic lines across the battlefield. Mortar teams adjusted angles with small, precise hand movements, motions that looked almost machine-trained in their efficiency. When the two forces met, the impact felt strangely asymmetrical. German resistance remained fierce, but their momentum had evaporated. Their attacks lacked the forward thrust that once defined them. Their movements carried hesitation, subtle but detectable. Their supply lines, strained by distance and air harassment, could not keep pace with the demands of continued offensive action. Rommel's officers attempted to establish a new defensive line, but the Americans pressed relentlessly. And not recklessly, relentlessly. Every time German armor tried to pivot, Shermans and tank destroyers were already adjusting. Every time German infantry attempted a counter-movement, American machine guns shifted with anticipatory precision. The battlefield, once a place of German tempo, now resonated with an American rhythm. At midday, P-40s and A-20s entered the fight again. Their attack runs came in tight patterns, each one carving lines of force across the sand. Bombs struck German staging areas, igniting fuel trucks in orange bursts that flickered like corrupted frames in a film reel. Rommel realized the truth he had sensed the day before. The offensive potential of the Afrika Korps had reached its limit. He issued orders to withdraw to more defensible positions near the outskirts of Kasserine and beyond, orders intended not as retreat but as preservation. German units began falling back in controlled increments, the desert vibrating under the movement of engines that sounded strained, tired, almost fatigued. Their silhouettes blurred into the dust, merging into elongated shapes that looked half real, half distortion. The Americans continued to advance, but now with tempered control. Their goal was not annihilation, it was reclaiming ground, re-establishing dominance, and proving to themselves that the collapse of days earlier did not define them. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the direction of momentum was unmistakable. The two corps had reversed the course of battle. Rommel was no longer advancing, he was withdrawing. And the desert, with its crystalline neutrality, recorded every movement of this reversal with perfect silence. By the evening of February 24th, Rommel's withdrawal had settled into a structured pattern. It was not a rout. Far from it. German units pulled back in disciplined formations, maintaining rearguards and coordinated timing. The Afrika Korps was battered, depleted, and low on fuel, but still fully capable of shaping its exit from the battlefield. The Americans watched this measured retreat with a mixture of caution and newfound confidence. Rommel was leaving Kasserine, and the II Corps was still standing. This simple fact carried enormous psychological weight. As Americans advanced to reclaim ground lost days earlier, they found the desert scarred by evidence of both armies' struggles: burnt-out hulls, spent shell casings, deep tread marks etched like temporary hieroglyphs into the sand. Some vehicles looked melted, as if heat had softened their shapes into curved, unnatural lines. Others stood frozen in place, perfectly preserved despite the violence around them. These relics of battle became silent instructors. Officers and enlisted men alike walked among the wrecks, analyzing impact patterns, tracing shrapnel paths with their fingers, identifying weak angles and strong positions. Soldiers discussed what had gone wrong, what had gone right, what needed to change. There was no attempt to hide mistakes, only a hunger to understand them. This hunger became doctrine. In field headquarters, some newly constructed, others improvised on the hoods of idling trucks, American commanders reviewed the battle with a forensic intensity. Every failure recorded, every delay mapped, every miscommunication analyzed. The II Corps had been forced to learn in days what other armies had learned over years. General Eisenhower's staff emphasized new priorities: decentralization of command, faster decision cycles, flexible defensive lines, integrated armor infantry tactics, immediate correction of communication latency, realistic terrain analysis, faster reconnaissance loops. These were not abstract lessons. They were carved directly into the memory of every soldier who survived the pass. German withdrawal continued steadily, their rear elements covering the movement with bursts of fire that echoed through the valley like muffled pulses, sharp, then delayed, as if the desert air were misaligning the sound. The Americans followed, but not recklessly. They advanced in measured steps, maintaining spacing, securing flanks, and avoiding the overextension that had doomed them days earlier. Engineers pushed forward to repair roads carved into unnatural shapes by tank tracks. These roads twisted at odd angles, forming patterns that looked almost algorithmic from a distance: loops, arcs, intersecting lines where convoys had become tangled under fire. The engineers reshaped them into straight, stable routes, leaving behind fresh lines in the sand that glowed faintly under the evening sun. Medical teams recovered survivors, both American and German, their movements calm and efficient. Field hospitals had grown more organized since the battle's first chaotic days. Now they functioned with a rhythm that felt intentional, steady, deliberate, almost metronomic. For the II Corps, this moment marked a profound transition. They had entered Kasserine as an army that believed doctrine could replace experience. They left it as an army that understood the price of learning. The transformation was not theoretical, it was visible in posture, demeanor, and communication. Officers spoke with sharper clarity. NCOs executed tasks without hesitation. Soldiers carried themselves with the self-awareness of men who had confronted their own unpreparedness and survived. Rommel's troops continued withdrawing toward the Mareth line, leaving dust trails that shimmered in the low light. Their silhouettes grew smaller, distorted by heat and distance, until they appeared as faint, flickering outlines, half real, half mirage. And as the Americans watched the last of the Afrika Korps disappear over the horizon, they understood something essential. They had not defeated Rommel. But they had not been defeated by him, either. And that distinction would reshape the U.S. Army forever. The desert, ancient, silent, impartial, absorbed the end of the battle with the same precision with which it had observed its beginning. When the dust finally settled over Kasserine, the II Corps stood on ground that felt heavier than it had days earlier. Heavier with memory, with mistakes, with the weight of a battle that had stripped illusions as efficiently as any weapon. The Americans were not triumphant. They were changed. Reports from the front reached Eisenhower's headquarters with a tone that was neither defeatist nor triumphant. It was analytical. Officers described what had gone wrong with a clarity that felt almost clinical, like surgeons reviewing a difficult operation. The chaos of the retreat, the collapse of communication, the flawed command structure, the misalignment of units, all of it was documented, dissected, understood. Kasserine became a mirror. A harsh one, but a necessary one. The U.S. Army leadership took the reflection seriously. Fredendall, whose distant, fragmented command style had amplified the disaster, was relieved of duty. His bunker, built far behind the lines, remained an empty monument to the dangers of leadership divorced from reality. In his place came General George S. Patton, a commander whose presence at the front was immediate, unmistakable, and disruptive in the way the two corps needed. Patton brought discipline that bordered on relentless. Movements became precise. Timetables tightened. Units learned to anticipate orders before they were spoken. The two corps transformed from a loose structure into an integrated organism. Kasserine had taught them the cost of not being one. Across the desert, German accounts painted a different picture. Rommel acknowledged that the Americans had been inexperienced, yes, but not incapable. They learn quickly, he noted. Too quickly. His officers agreed. What began as an easy exploitation had turned into a hard-fought withdrawal. The Americans had absorbed the Afrika Korps' harsh lessons in days that had taken other armies years. Back in Washington, analysts examined the battle with similar intensity. They identified systemic issues, rigid doctrine, insufficient combined arms training, inadequate reconnaissance cycles, and overly centralized command structures. Solutions began forming in memos and briefings, solutions that would fundamentally reshape the American way of war. Kasserine did not break the two corps. It recalibrated it. And the recalibration rippled outward. Within months, American divisions would fight differently, faster, tighter, more adaptive. They would enter Tunisia with renewed coherence, Sicily with growing skill, Italy with hardened resolve, and France with a doctrine refined through both theory and trauma. What emerged from the other side of Kasserine was not a perfect army, but a learning one, a scalable one, a dangerous one. The battlefield itself returned to silence, though it carried the imprint of the struggle. Burned-out hulls cooling under the fading sun, trenches collapsing quietly in the wind, footsteps erased grain by grain. The desert does not hold ruins long, but it holds memory. In some way, it remembers through absence, an archive written in negative space. As night fell across the valley where the Americans had nearly collapsed, the air cooled into sharp, thin layers. Stars emerged in brilliant, unblinking clusters, scattered across the sky like fragments of a broken code. Soldiers looked up at them, exhausted, dust-covered, transformed, and felt, perhaps for the first time, that they had stepped through something irreversible. Kasserine was not victory. It was not defeat. It was calibration through fire. And in that calibration lay the blueprint of the army that would cross the Atlantic, cross Europe, and shape the outcome of the war. The desert itself, patient, ancient, perfectly neutral, held the final resonance of the battle in its vast and unspoken memory. A memory the Americans would carry forward, again and again, long after the sand reclaimed every trace of what happened there.